The storm had been crawling over Ashfield all night, its rhythm steady against the windows of Mike Reynolds' modest apartment. At 2 in the morning, the world felt unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that usually precedes something unexpected. He should have been asleep hours ago, but Tim had woken again, shaken by another nightmare about monsters hiding in closets. It had taken a warm cup of milk, a blanket fresh from the dryer, and Mike's quiet humming of an old Bruce Springsteen tune to coax his son back into slumber. Now the 7-year-old lay curled beneath his rocket ship comforter, one small fist still clutching a worn teddy bear, as if it were the last anchor in a restless sea. Mike stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting the soft rise and fall of his son's breathing remind him why he endured the long shifts at Harper's distribution center, the empty refrigerator, and the aching loneliness that came once the lights were out. He turned back toward the kitchen, poured the dregs of yesterday's coffee into his mug, and braced himself for a few more hours awake. His hands were raw from warehouse work, his back sore from lifting boxes all day, but at least in this quiet he could breathe. The small 2-bedroom apartment on the second floor of the old converted Victorian house on Pine Street wasn't much, but it was theirs. Or it would be if he could keep up with the rent. A stack of bills sat on the kitchen table. Electric notice with a red final warning stamp, Tim's medical bills from his last asthma attack, and a past due notice from the landlord. Mike ran a calloused hand across his face, feeling the 3-day stubble scratch against his palm. He'd been picking up extra shifts at the warehouse whenever possible, but since the company had cut back on overtime, making ends meet had become nearly impossible. That's when the phone rang. The sound cut sharply against the hush of the storm. Unknown caller. The clock read 1:59 a.m. Mike frowned, thumb hovering over the screen. At this hour, every instinct told him to let it ring out. Nothing good ever waits at 2 in the morning. And yet against reason, he answered. Hello. For a heartbeat, there was only static in the storm. Then a woman's voice, broken and trembling, came through. Please don't hang up. Just come. Willowbrook Estate. I can't breathe. The line went dead before he could respond. Mike stood frozen, staring at the phone as if it might explain itself. It could have been a prank, a wrong number, someone in trouble dialing randomly. The logical choice, the safe choice, was to put the phone down, crawl back into bed, and forget the call ever happened. He thought of Tim sleeping peacefully in the next room, and every part of him screamed to stay home. But something about that voice clung to him. It wasn't staged, it wasn't attention-seeking, it was raw, desperate, real. The kind of voice that belonged to someone standing at the edge of something terrible. Mike walked to Tim's room, looking down at his sleeping son. 3 years ago, when Kate's car had been hit by a drunk driver on her way home from a night shift at the hospital, he had promised himself he would never leave Tim alone. Not for a moment, not for anything. He grabbed the boy's inhaler from the nightstand, checking that it still had medicine, and tucked it into his pocket along with a spare. Then, with gentle hands that had once crafted fine furniture, but now mostly lifted boxes, he wrapped Tim in his rocket ship comforter and lifted him from the bed. The boy stirred slightly but didn't wake as Mike carried him down to the old Ford F-150 pickup that had seen better days just like its owner. He placed Tim carefully in the back seat, making sure he was secure and warm before climbing into the driver's seat. The engine coughed reluctantly to life headlights, cutting through sheets of rain as he turned onto the road leading north. His rational mind listed every reason this was reckless. He didn't know who she was or what waited for him at Willowbrook Estate. It could be a mistake, even a danger, and yet his hands stayed steady on the wheel. The storm swallowed the truck, rain hammering harder as he climbed into the wooded hills above town. Each curve in the road felt like a question he couldn't yet answer. But the truth was simple: when someone calls out into the darkness, sometimes you don't weigh the risks. Sometimes you just go. The GPS directed him through parts of Ashfield he'd never visited, where old money lived in houses bigger than his entire apartment building and such. The roads widened, lined with stone walls and mature oaks. Even through the downpour, Mike could sense the shift in landscape from his working-class neighborhood to somewhere that operated by different rules. The sort of place where people like him came to mow lawns or fix pipes, not to answer desperate late-night calls. On the left, half hidden under decades of ivy growth, a tarnished brass plaque leaned against the rain. 48 Willowbrook Estate. No gate, just a long, narrow drive, rising like a dark ribbon between towering oaks. The truck groaned as he guided it uphill, its headlights catching reflections in puddles, that seemed to grow deeper with each yard. His heart pounded harder with each bend in the driveway. He should turn back, he told himself. Go home to safety. This isn't your world. But the voice replayed in his head, ragged and fractured. I can't breathe. And he pressed on. At the top of the hill, the mansion appeared, or what was left of it. Willowbrook Estate stood like a memory refusing to fade. Victorian grandeur with turrets and gables, wraparound porches, and dozens of windows staring out like vacant eyes. Moss streaked its stone walls. Shutters sagged. Paint had long surrendered to rain and rot. Yet the porch light glowed steady against the storm, as though someone inside was waiting. Mike killed the engine and glanced back at Tim, still sound asleep in his blanket cocoon. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, and the house was just a sprint away. He could leave the boy for 30 seconds, just long enough to check if this was indeed the right place, if someone truly needed help. Decision made, he stepped out into the rain. It hit him in sheets, soaking his jacket before he reached the steps. He lifted the tarnished brass knocker, hesitated, then let it fall. A hollow sound echoed into the house. For a breath, nothing. Then the door creaked open. She stood there, barefoot, hem of her silk nightgown, heavy with rain that must have come through an open window somewhere. Her dark hair clung to a face that magazines would call striking rather than conventionally beautiful. High cheekbones, full lips now pale with cold, and eyes so deeply brown they appeared almost black in the dim light. Those eyes were rimmed red, not with sleep, but with something deeper. A crystal glass trembled in her hand, amber liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. For a moment she looked at him as if she recognized him, or wished she hadn't called at all. Her gaze, though bloodshot, held a startling clarity. "You're not Dr. Morgan," she whispered. Mike shook his head gently. "No, I got a call from this address. A woman who sounded like she needed help." Her gaze flickered past him into the storm, as if expecting someone else. The glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor. She swayed, knees buckling, and Mike lunged forward, catching her before she hit the ground. Her body was light, almost fragile in his arms, trembling like a bird caught in a storm. He guided her inside past the shards of crystal into a living room that smelled faintly of dust and old smoke. The room bore the grandeur of another life. An ornate fireplace, cold and dark, heavy curtains sagging from rods, portraits staring down from cracked frames. He eased her onto a tufted couch, tugged a throw blanket from a nearby chair, and draped it over her shoulders. She shivered beneath it, though her eyes stayed lucid. "I thought," she managed, voice paper thin, "I thought I called my therapist. I must have hit the wrong number." Mike crouched beside her. "It's all right, you're not alone now." She blinked at him as if the words themselves were strange. Then she let out a breath that sounded like defeat. "There's no one left to call." Her eyes weren't drunk, not really. They were too clear for that. This was grief. Grief that hollowed rather than dulled. Mike Rose found a bin of logs near the hearth and struck a match to the kindling beneath them. The fire sputtered, then caught light, pushing back years of cold as warmth filled the room. The storm softened outside, its anger spent. He straightened and glanced toward the door. "I have my son in the truck. I need to bring him in." She looked up, startled, as if the concept of a child was something foreign. "Of course, Dane." When Mike returned with Tim still asleep in his arms, she had moved to sit closer to the fire, the blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. She watched him settle the boy on a nearby chaise lounge, tucking the rocket ship comforter around him. "I'm Catherine Sinclair," she said softly, "and I haven't let anyone in this house for 4 years." The fire snapped, throwing sparks as if punctuating her confession. Mike settled into an armchair across from her. "Mike Reynolds, and that's Tim." Catherine's eyes moved to the sleeping boy, something softening in her expression. "How old is he?" 7, almost 8. Mike felt the familiar ache whenever he thought about Tim's birthdays. His mother won't see him turn 8. Catherine's gaze returned to him, a flicker of recognition passing between them. The recognition of loss carried like an invisible weight. "What happened?" The question was gentle, without the usual prying curiosity that often accompanied it. "Car accident. 3 years ago, drunk driver hit her on her way home from work." The words were practiced, delivered in the same flat tone he always used, as if keeping them emotionless might keep them from cutting. "I'm sorry." The words were simple, but her eyes held the knowledge that such platitudes meant nothing in the face of such loss. Does he remember her? Mike nodded, glancing at his son. Some days more than others. He has her eyes, her laugh. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks. Catherine pulled the blanket tighter, her gaze drifting to the large portrait above the mantel. A family of four. A distinguished man with silver at his temples, a elegant woman with Catherine's same striking features, a teenage girl with a bright smile, and Catherine herself looking younger and unburdened. My family died in a plane crash, she said, the words falling like stones into still water. Our private jet went down over Wyoming 4 years ago. My parents and my sister Jessica. I was supposed to be with them. Her lips trembled slightly. We'd had an argument. I refused to go. Mike didn't offer empty comfort or platitudes. He just nodded slowly, understanding what it meant to carry something too heavy for words. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was a shared space where grief could breathe without explanation. Tim stirred on the chaise, eyes fluttering open. He blinked owlishly at the unfamiliar surroundings, gaze traveling from the ornate ceiling to the crackling fire, finally settling on the strange woman wrapped in a blanket. Instead of fear, curiosity filled his face. Dad, his voice was still thick with sleep. Where are we? Mike moved to sit beside him. This is Ms. Sinclair's house. You were sleeping, but I had to help her with something, so I brought you along. Tim's eyes widened as he took in the grandeur of the room, even in its neglected state. It looks like a castle. A ghost of a smile touched Catherine's lips, there and gone in an instant. It's not quite a castle, just an old house that's been in my family for generations. Tim sat up, the rocket ship comforter pooling around his waist. His gaze fixed on the large windows that lined the far wall, rain still streaming down their panes. Through them, even in the darkness, the outline of what appeared to be a large glass structure was barely visible. What's that? He asked, pointing. Catherine followed his gaze, something shifting in her expression. That's the conservatory, my mother's pride and joy. She grew orchids there. Her voice caught slightly. Or she used to. Can I see it? Tim's innocent enthusiasm cut through the somber atmosphere. Catherine's body tensed visibly. It's not in good shape anymore. I haven't been in there since. She let the sentence hang unfinished, but its meaning was clear. Tim's face fell, but he nodded with a solemnity beyond his years, as if he understood more than a child should have to. The empathy in his young face seemed to touch something in Catherine. She stood suddenly, the blanket falling from her shoulders. Perhaps in the morning, if you'd like. Morning, the word hung in the air in acknowledgement that they wouldn't be leaving immediately. Mike glanced at the window where rain still poured at the clock showing nearly 3 a.m., and at his son, who had already begun to drift back to sleep. It would be dangerous to drive back down that winding road in this weather, especially with Tim. Catherine seemed to read his thoughts. There are guest rooms, several. You should stay until the storm passes. Mike hesitated, pride warring with practicality. We've imposed enough. Please. The word held more than a simple request. It held the loneliness of 4 years wrapped in a single syllable. It's the least I can do after dragging you out here in the middle of the night. He nodded, gathering Tim back into his arms. Catherine led them up a sweeping staircase to the second floor, down a hallway lined with more family portraits, generations of Sinclairs staring down from gilded frames. She opened a door to a bedroom that, despite clear signs of disuse, was still more luxurious than anything in Mike's apartment. The bathroom is through there, she said, gesturing to a connecting door. There should be towels, and I'll find something dry for you to wear. Before he could protest, she was gone, her footsteps fading down the hallway. Mike settled Tim on the bed, the boy barely stirring as he was tucked beneath heavy covers. He stood for a moment, taking in the ornate furniture, the silk wallpaper, the crystal chandelier hanging from a medallion ceiling. This room alone was probably worth more than everything he'd ever owned. Catherine returned with a stack of folded clothes. These were my father's. They might be a bit large, but they're dry. Mike accepted them with awkward thanks. Up close in the better light of the hallway, he could see more clearly the toll that 4 years of grief had taken on her. Though she couldn't be older than mid-30s, there was a fragility to her, as if she might crack if touched too roughly. And yet beneath that, something resilient remained. A core of steel that grief hadn't quite managed to erode. "Why did you answer?" she asked suddenly. "My call. It was the middle of the night. I could have been anyone." Mike considered the question, searching for the truth beneath the obvious answer. "You sounded like you needed someone, and I know what that feels like." Catherine held his gaze for a long moment, as if measuring the weight of his words. Then she nodded once, a simple acknowledgement of a truth recognized. "Good night, Mr. Reynolds." "Mike," he corrected gently. "Mike," she repeated the name sounding almost foreign on her tongue. "Good night." As she turned to go, Mike noticed for the first time the faint scar on her wrist partially hidden by the sleeve of her nightgown. A thin white line that told his own story. He said nothing, but the sight of it settled something in him. The certainty that answering her call, regardless of the circumstances, had been the right choice. Dawn crept slowly over Ashfield's soft light, pushing its way past the storm's retreat. For the first time in years, Willowbrook Estate looked less like a mausoleum and more like a house remembering it once held life. Mike woke stiff in the unfamiliar bed, the scent of dust and old cologne clinging to the borrowed pajamas he wore. Tim was already up, standing at the window, nose pressed against the glass as he surveyed the estate grounds now visible in morning light. "Dad, there's a pond and a maze, and the glass house is huge." Mike joined him at the window. The grounds of Willowbrook stretched out before them, once immaculately landscaped, but now wild with neglect. The formal gardens had surrendered to nature hedges, overgrown pathways choked with weeds. And at the far edge of what must have once been a beautiful lawn, the conservatory stood, an enormous Victorian structure of iron and glass, its panes clouded with years of grime, but its bones still proud. "Can we go see it?" "Please." Tim bounced on his toes, more animated than Mike had seen him in months. "That's up to Ms. Sinclair. It's her house, buddy." They found Catherine in the kitchen, a vast space with copper pots hanging unused above a massive island. She wore simple jeans and a sweater, now her hair pulled back, making her look younger but no less haunted. She stood before an ancient coffee maker that sputtered reluctantly to life. "I'm afraid I don't have much to offer for breakfast," she said, not turning around. "I don't cook often, or at all, really." Mike waved away her concern. "Coffee is plenty. We don't want to impose." "The kitchen used to be full of people," she said, her gaze distant as she stared at the struggling coffee maker. "Staff, family, friends, my mother's garden club. Now it's just empty." Tim, never one for awkward silences, pointed toward the window. "Can we see the glass house? Dad says we have to ask permission." Catherine seemed startled by the direct question, as if unused to the straightforward nature of children. She hesitated, something like fear flickering across her face. "The conservatory hasn't been maintained in years. It's probably not safe." "We'll be careful," Tim promised solemnly. "I'm really good at being careful. Ask Dad." Mike placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "Tim's right about being careful, but we understand if you'd rather not." Catherine's gaze moved between them, lingering on Tim's hopeful face. Something shifted in her expression, a decision forming behind those dark eyes. "After coffee," she said finally, "I'll show you." The walk across the neglected grounds was like traveling through time. Grass grew knee-high in places, reclaiming formal pathways. Stone benches peeked out from beneath climbing vines. A fountain stood dry at the center of what had once been a circular rose garden, its basin filled with dead leaves instead of water. "My mother spent every Saturday in these gardens," Catherine said as they walked. "She had a gift for coaxing stubborn plants into bloom. Unlike me." Tim skipped ahead, stopping occasionally to examine an interesting rock or a particularly vibrant wildflower that had seeded itself among the weeds. His natural curiosity seemed to lighten the weight that hung over Catherine. "He's a remarkable boy," she observed quietly, "after everything he's been through." Mike nodded, pride mixing with the ever-present ache. "Kids are resilient, more than we give them credit for." "And are you resilient too?" The question caught him off guard with its directness. "I'm still standing. Some days that's enough." They reached the conservatory, its grandeur unmistakable despite years of neglect. The Victorian ironwork formed elaborate patterns between the glass panes, soaring up to a central dome that must have once flooded the interior with light. Now many panes were cracked or missing entirely, and those that remained were so coated with grime that they admitted only a murky illumination. Catherine stood before the double doors, her hand resting on the tarnished handle but not turning it. Her breathing quickened slightly. I haven't been inside since before the accident, she admitted. I couldn't bear it. This was my mother's sanctuary. Mike didn't push. He simply waited, giving her the space to decide. Tim, sensing the importance of the moment, stood quietly at his side. With a deep breath, Catherine turned the handle. The door's protested hinges groaning from disuse but eventually gave way. The smell hit them first. Damp earth, rotting plant matter, stagnant water. But beneath it, surprisingly, the faint sweetness of something still in bloom. They stepped inside into a jungle gone wild. What had once been orderly planting beds and pathways had transformed into a tangle of vegetation. Plants that had escaped their pond now grew directly from the earthen floor, climbing toward broken panes where rainwater entered freely. Delicate orchids had long since surrendered to hardier species. Ferns and vines dominated, thriving in the humid, untended space. "Oh my," Catherine whispered, hand covering her mouth as she took in the transformation. Tim, however, was entranced. He moved carefully along what remained of the central path, eyes wide with wonder rather than disappointment. "It's like a secret jungle," he breathed. "Look, Dad, that plant is growing right through the table." He was right. An ambitious philodendron had pushed its way through a crack in an old potting table, splitting the wood as it reached for light. What should have been a sign of destruction instead appeared almost triumphant, life finding a way despite abandonment. "They're not all dead," Mike observed, noting various plants that had not only survived but thrived in the changed environment. "Some have just adapted." Catherine moved deeper into the space, her initial shock giving way to a reluctant fascination. She stopped before a large fern, its fronds spreading magnificently across a broken stone planter. This was one of Mother's favorites. She called it her prehistoric friend. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "I never thought it would survive without her care." "Plants are survivors," Mike said, running his fingers along a sturdy bamboo stalk that had grown to touch the glass ceiling. "They don't need much, just enough light, enough water, and they'll find a way." Tim had discovered a small section where delicate orchids somehow clung to life, their exotic blooms a startling splash of color amid the chaos. "Ms. Sinclair, look at these, they have faces." Catherine moved to his side, kneeling despite the dirt that immediately clung to her jeans. "Moth orchids," she identified, genuine surprise in her voice. "Mother's prized specimens. I can't believe they have survived." Something changed in her face as she gently touched one of the delicate blooms, a softening as if a memory long suppressed had finally broken through. "She would spend hours talking to them," Catherine said quietly. "I used to think it was silly. Now I understand." Tim nodded seriously. "Plants like it when you talk to them. My teacher, Mrs. Peterson, says it's the carbon dioxide, but I think they just like the company." For the first time since they'd met her, Catherine laughed, a small, rusty sound as if long out of practice. The sound seemed to surprise even her. She covered her mouth quickly, but her eyes retained the momentary lightness. Mike found himself fixing broken panes where he could, propping up fallen shelves, examining the irrigation system that had long since stopped functioning. His hands, always more comfortable with practical tasks, moved of their own accord. "You don't have to do that," Catherine said, watching him secure a loose shelf. "Force of habit," he replied with a shrug. "I used to build things before the warehouse. Can't help tinkering." "Build things?" "Furniture mostly. I had a small workshop, Reynolds Custom Creations." The name felt strange on his tongue, a relic of another life. They spent the morning exploring the conservatory, Tim naming plants with imaginative titles. Bruce the Brave, for a particularly robust fern, Mighty Martha, for a surviving orchid. Catherine, initially hesitant, began to point out plants she remembered from childhood, sharing fragments of memories that seemed to surprise her with their clarity. When they finally emerged back into daylight, something had shifted. Catherine stood taller, her gaze more focused on the present than lost in the past. Tim had dirt smudged across his cheek and enthusiasm radiating from every pore. And Mike found himself looking at the neglected estate with different eyes, seeing not just decay, but potential. The sound of tires on gravel broke the moment. A sleek black Mercedes pulled up the drive, stopping with precision before the main house. The man who emerged moved with the confident efficiency of someone accustomed to being in charge. Mid-40s, expensively dressed, with the kind of grooming that spoke of regular maintenance. His stride faltered momentarily when he spotted the group returning from the conservatory, genuine surprise crossing his features before being carefully masked behind a professional smile. "Catherine," he called, approaching with measured steps. "I've been trying to reach you." His gaze traveled over Mike's borrowed clothes and Tim's dirt-smudged face assessment, clear in his expression. When he returned his attention to Catherine, his smile didn't reach his eyes. "I don't recall you mentioning hiring new groundskeepers." Catherine straightened slightly, something in her demeanor shifting from the open woman of moments before to someone more guarded. "They're not staff, Richard. They're guests." Richard Blackwood, for that was clearly who this was, adjusted his expression to one of polite interest, though the calculation never left his eyes. "Guests how unexpected." He extended a manicured hand toward Mike. "Richard Blackwood. I manage the Sinclair family assets." Mike accepted the handshake, acutely aware of his calloused palm against Richard's smooth one of his borrowed clothes against Richard's tailored suit. "Mike Reynolds, and this is my son, Tim." Richard's gaze barely flickered to the boy before returning to Catherine. "I've brought the papers we discussed for the Apex development proposal." His tone suggested this was a conversation they had had many times before. "They're prepared to increase their offer by 15%, which is extremely generous given the property's condition." Catherine's expression closed further. "I told you I'm not ready to make that decision." Catherine, Richard's voice held the practiced patience of someone speaking to a child. "We've been discussing this for over a year. The house is falling apart around you. The taxes alone are—" "Not today, Richard." Her tone was final with a firmness that seemed to surprise both Richard and herself. "I have guests." Richard's smile tightened, but he recovered quickly. "Of course, forgive me." He glanced at Mike again, this time with barely concealed suspicion. "Perhaps another time would be more appropriate." He handed Catherine a leather portfolio. "The papers are inside when you're ready. The offer expires at the end of the month." With a final nod that deliberately excluded Mike and Tim, he returned to his car. As the Mercedes disappeared down the drive, a visible tension drained from Catherine's shoulders. She held the portfolio as if it might contain something unpleasant. "I should explain," she began, but Mike shook his head. "You don't owe us any explanations. We've imposed enough." He glanced at Tim, who had wandered a few steps away to examine a particularly interesting beetle. "We should be heading back to town anyway." Catherine looked momentarily stricken, as if their departure was something she hadn't considered. "Of course. Let me get your clothes. They should be dry by now." They walked back to the house in silence, the easy camaraderie of the morning overshadowed by Richard's brief but disruptive presence. Inside, Catherine disappeared upstairs, returning minutes later with Mike's clothes now clean and dry. While Mike changed, Catherine found a small paper bag and filled it with apples from the kitchen, the only food she seemed to have on hand. She offered it to Tim with a hesitant smile. "For the journey home, in case you get hungry." Tim accepted the bag with solemn gratitude. "Thank you for showing us your jungle house. It's the coolest place I've ever seen." Something in Catherine's expression softened. "You're welcome back any time to see how the jungle grows." Mike returned now dressed in his own clothes, the borrowed ones folded neatly in his arms. "Thank you for your hospitality, and I'm sorry about the circumstances." Catherine took the folded clothes, her fingers brushing his momentarily. "Don't be. I'm the one who should apologize for dragging you out in the middle of the night." "Well, technically you were trying to call your therapist," Mike reminded her with a small smile. "Dr. Morgan." "Yes." She glanced down at the phone in her pocket. "His number is only one digit different from yours, apparently." An awkward silence fell between them, the kind that comes when strangers have shared an unexpected intimacy and now must return to their separate worlds. Mike took out his phone, hesitated, then held it out. "Put your number in case you need anything." Catherine looked surprised but took the phone. "I don't usually. It doesn't have to be an emergency. Maybe you just want to tell us how Bruce the Brave and Mighty Martha are doing." She smiled, then a real smile that transformed her face, making her look younger, unburdened, for a brief moment. She entered her number and handed the phone back. "Drive safely," she said, walking them to the door. Tim waved enthusiastically as they headed to the truck. "Bye, Miss Sinclair. I'll find more plant names for next time." Mike helped Tim into the passenger seat, buckling him in before climbing in himself. As the engine rumbled to life, he glanced back at the house. Catherine stood in the doorway, a solitary figure framed by the grand but fading mansion. She raised one hand in a small wave, then stepped back inside, closing the door behind her. As they wound their way back down the long drive, Tim munched happily on an apple, already planning what they might discover on their next visit to the conservatory. Mike let him chatter his own thoughts, turning over the strange sequence of events that had brought them to Willowbrook Estate. In the clear light of day, the estate looked different, less haunting, more melancholic, like something beautiful that had been forgotten rather than something ominous. The truck passed through the stone gates and back onto the main road, leaving behind the world of Willowbrook for the familiar streets of their working-class neighborhood. Mike's phone buzzed with a text as they pulled up to their apartment building. A number he didn't recognize, with a simple message: "Thank you for coming when I called. KS." He smiled slightly as he pocketed the phone. Something told him this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed. The week that followed slipped back into familiar rhythms. Mike worked long shifts at Harper's distribution center, lifting boxes until his back ached and his hands were raw. Tim went to school, did his homework, and asked at least once a day when they might visit Miss Sinclair's jungle house again. And the bills continued to pile up on the kitchen table, red notices becoming more frequent. The latest blow came Friday afternoon. Harper's was cutting back hours for all warehouse staff, effective immediately. Mike's already tight schedule would be reduced by 10 hours a week, a loss of income he couldn't afford. The manager delivered the news with practiced corporate sympathy, assuring everyone it was temporary just until market conditions improved. But the worried looks exchanged across the break room told a different story. Mike sat at the kitchen table that night after Tim was asleep, calculator in hand, trying to make numbers work that simply wouldn't. Even with cutting back every non-essential expense, they would be short on rent next month. And Tim's asthma medication couldn't wait. The inhaler was running low and the prescription refill would cost more than he could currently spare. His phone sat on the table beside the scattered bills. He'd thought about calling Catherine several times during the week, but had always stopped himself. What would he say? "Thanks for letting us crash during a storm. How are the plants doing?" It felt presumptuous, like reaching across a divide that separated their worlds. The phone rang, startling him from his calculations. Unknown caller, but this time he recognized the number. Catherine. Her voice came through clear without the desperate edge of that first call. "Mike, I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No, not at all." He pushed aside the bills, oddly relieved by the interruption. "I was wondering." She paused, seeming to gather courage. "The conservatory. I've been thinking about trying to restore it, at least partially. And I thought perhaps you and Tim might be interested in helping. I'd pay you, of course." Mike blinked, surprised by the offer. "I don't know much about plants. But you know about building, fixing things?" Another pause. "And Tim has a gift for naming things." The mention of his son made Mike smile despite himself. "He hasn't stopped talking about your jungle house all week." "Is that what he calls it?" The smile was audible in her voice. "It's accurate, I suppose." She hesitated again. "Would you consider it coming out this weekend to help? I'd make sure it was worth your while." Mike glanced at the bills spread across the table, at the notice of reduced hours, at the prescription that needed refilling. Pride warred with practicality. "We could come tomorrow," he said finally, "but I want to be clear about payment. Fair wages for fair work, not charity." "Of course," she agreed quickly. "Just help me bring it back to life." The next morning, Mike and Tim drove back up to Willowbrook Estate. Tim bounced in his seat, full of excitement about seeing the jungle house again. Mike's feelings were more mixed, grateful for the work, but uncomfortable crossing the invisible boundary between their worlds. Catherine Sinclair lived in a different reality, one where financial stress meant deciding which vacation home to visit, not which bill to pay first. But when they pulled up the long drive and saw her waiting on the front steps, something in Mike's chest eased. She looked different. Jeans and a simple sweater, hair pulled back, work gloves already in hand. Less the isolated heiress, more a woman ready to get her hands dirty. "You came," she said, relief evident in her voice, as if she'd half expected them to change their minds. Tim scrambled out of the truck before it had fully stopped. "We brought tools. Dad has a whole box in the back. And I found a book about plants at the library." Catherine's smile was warm as she knelt to his level. That's perfect. We'll need all the help we can get. Mike unloaded his old toolbox, one of the few remnants of his former career that he hadn't been forced to sell. It contained the basics: hammers, screwdrivers, wrenches a level. Not the specialized woodworking tools he'd once owned, but enough for simple repairs. As they walked toward the conservatory, Catherine outlined her vision. I thought we could start by making it safe, fixing the broken glass, clearing the paths, not trying to restore it completely, just make it functional again. The conservatory looked different in the clear morning light, less haunting, more full of possibility. Inside, the tangle of vegetation still dominated, but now Mike could better see the bones of the place. The iron framework was mostly sound, though rusted in places. Many glass panes were broken or missing entirely. The irrigation system had long since failed, but the structure itself was solid. It's salvageable, he assessed, running a hand along one of the iron supports. Needs work, but the foundation is good. Catherine nodded, something like hope flickering in her eyes. Where should we start? They began with the basics, clearing pathways through the overgrowth, identifying plants worth saving versus invasive species that had taken advantage of the neglect. Tim appointed himself plant identifier, consulting his library book with intense concentration before declaring each specimen's fate. Catherine worked alongside them, initially hesitant, but growing more confident as the morning progressed. Mike focused on structural issues, securing loose shelving, examining the irrigation pipes for salvageable sections, assessing which glass panes could be temporarily repaired versus those needing complete replacement. He found himself slipping into the familiar rhythm of problem-solving that had once been his daily work before boxes and inventory sheets had replaced wood and measuring tape. By midday, they had cleared a significant section near the center of the conservatory. Weak winter sunlight streamed through the cleaner panes, illuminating the progress they'd made. They sat on an old stone bench to rest, sharing sandwiches Catherine had thought to prepare, a simple gesture that nonetheless suggested she was emerging from her isolation. You're good at this, Catherine observed, watching Mike examine a section of pipe. You said you used to build furniture. Mike nodded, hands automatically cleaning his tools as he spoke. Had my own shop for about 5 years, Reynolds Custom Creations, specialized in children's furniture. Beds shaped like boats, desks with hidden compartments, that sort of thing. What happened? She asked the question gently, as if sensing the weight behind it. Mike's hands stilled momentarily. Kate got sick, cancer. Insurance covered some, but not enough. I sold the shop to pay medical bills. Then after she died, he shrugged, the gesture containing years of struggle. Couldn't get it back. Ended up at the warehouse. Catherine's gaze held no pity, only understanding. You gave up your dream for her. Wouldn't call it giving up, just redirecting. Now it's about making sure Tim has what he needs. He gestured to where his son was carefully introducing himself to a particularly impressive fern. He's what matters. They worked through the afternoon, making steady progress. Mike repaired several broken panes with materials Catherine had ordered ahead of their arrival. Tim and Catherine carefully pruned overgrown plants, saving what could be saved, composting what couldn't. By late afternoon, a transformation was already visible. Not complete restoration, but the beginning of order emerging from chaos. As they packed up tools, Catherine handed Mike an envelope. As agreed. Mike hesitated before taking it, the reality of their different circumstances suddenly sharp again. I didn't track hours or anything. It's fair, she assured him. And I was hoping, maybe you could come back tomorrow. There's still so much to do. Before Mike could respond, the sound of tires on gravel announced another arrival. The sleek black Mercedes pulled up outside the conservatory. Richard Blackwood stepped out, his expression darkening when he spotted Mike. Catherine, he called, approaching with swift steps. I've been trying to reach you all day. His gaze traveled from Catherine's dirt-smudged hands to the cleared pathways visible through the conservatory doors. What exactly is going on here? Catherine straightened, something in her demeanor shifting. I'm restoring the conservatory, or beginning to at least. Richard's laugh held no humor. Restoring, Catherine, be reasonable. This place is beyond salvaging. The Apex offer includes demolishing all these outbuildings to make way for the new development. I haven't agreed to the Apex offer, Catherine reminded him, her voice cooler than Mike had yet heard it. Richard's smile tightened as he noticed Mike again. Mr. Reynolds, isn't it? I didn't realize Catherine had hired professional help. The way he said professional made it clear he considered Mike anything but. Mike kept his expression neutral, though his jaw tightened. He'd dealt with enough men like Richard Blackwood in his life, men who measured worth by bank accounts and addresses. Mr. Reynolds has been kind enough to lend his expertise, Catherine said, stepping slightly forward as if physically placing herself between the two men. Richard's gaze shifted to Tim, who had moved closer to his father, sensing the tension. And the child, is he also providing expertise? Tim is our official plant namer, Catherine replied with unexpected lightness. He's very good at it. Richard's expression made it clear he found nothing amusing about the situation. He turned back to Catherine, lowering his voice, though not enough to prevent Mike from hearing. Catherine, I understand you're going through a phase, finding new interests. His glance toward Mike made his meaning clear. But the apex deadline is approaching, and the Board of Trustees is expecting a decision. Your father would want— Don't tell me what my father would want. Catherine cut him off, her voice suddenly sharp. This is still my home, Richard, and these are my guests. Richard's composure slipped momentarily, revealing something harder beneath the polished exterior. He recovered quickly, straightening his already impeccable tie. We'll discuss this at a more appropriate time. He handed her another envelope, similar to the many Mike had seen piling up on his own table. The property tax assessment. It's increased again. With that parting shot, he returned to his car, the Mercedes pulling away with controlled speed. Catherine stood watching until it disappeared down the drive, the envelope clutched in her hand. When she turned back, her expression was carefully composed, though something troubled lingered in her eyes. I'm sorry about that, she said quietly. Mike shook his head. No need to apologize. An awkward silence fell between them, the easy rapport of the day's work disrupted by Richard's reminder of the gulf between their worlds. Catherine broke it first, kneeling down to Tim's level. Thank you for all your help today, Tim. Bruce the Brave is looking much happier already. Tim beamed with pride. I told him we'd come back to visit. Plants get lonely too. Catherine's smile held a touch of sadness. Yes, they do. She stood, turning to Mike. Same time tomorrow if you're still willing. Mike glanced at the conservatory and at the progress they'd made, at the envelope in his hand that would cover Tim's prescription and help with next month's rent. But more than that, he thought of Catherine's smile when Tim named a plant, of the way her shoulders had relaxed as they worked, of the moment when she'd stood up to Richard with unexpected strength. We'll be here, he promised. As they drove back down the winding drive, Tim already half asleep against the window, Mike found himself thinking not about the money or the work, but about Catherine standing alone in that enormous house, fighting battles he could only begin to understand. And for the first time in years, he felt something beyond the daily struggle to survive, a connection to someone else's journey, someone else's pain. The toolbox rattled in the truck bed as they turned onto the main road, leaving Willowbrook Estate behind, but carrying a piece of it with them. And somehow Mike knew they would return, drawn back not just by necessity, but by something neither he nor Catherine could yet name. The weekend at Willowbrook transformed into a full month of restoration work. Every Saturday and Sunday, Mike and Tim would drive up the winding road to find Catherine waiting, work gloves ready, determination growing with each visit. The routine brought unexpected stability to all three lives, giving Catherine purpose beyond grief, providing Mike with supplemental income that eased his financial strain, and delighting Tim with each new discovery in the gradually tamed jungle house. By the fourth weekend, the conservatory had undergone a remarkable transformation. The central pathways were clear, most broken panes replaced or repaired, and the irrigation system partially restored. Plants worth saving had been carefully pruned and repotted, while invasive species were systematically removed. Catherine had ordered special grow lights to supplement the weak winter sun, and the surviving orchids had responded with cautious new growth. Mike found himself applying skills long unused, improvising solutions with limited materials, the work engaging his mind in ways the warehouse never did. His hands, calloused from lifting boxes, remembered their old precision. He fashioned new shelving from reclaimed wood found in one of the estate's outbuildings, restored the antique potting bench to usable condition, and designed an ingenious rainwater collection system that pleased both Catherine and Tim with its efficiency. Tim had embraced his role as plant identifier with scholarly seriousness, meticulously labeling each specimen with hand-drawn tags featuring both proper botanical names and his own colorful monikers. The boy, who often struggled to focus at school, would spend hours cataloging leaves and flowers, consulting his growing collection of library books with intense concentration. On this particular Sunday afternoon, Mike finished installing the last section of replacement glass, while Catherine and Tim worked below arranging freshly potted ferns along the newly cleared eastern wall. The temperature outside hovered just above freezing, but inside the conservatory, the combination of grow lights and improved insulation created a pocket of humid warmth that felt almost tropical. Catherine stepped back to assess their progress, brushing soil from her hands. It's starting to look like a proper conservatory again. She'd changed over these weeks of work, subtly but unmistakably. The hollowness in her cheeks had filled slightly color, returning to her previously pale complexion. She laughed more readily at Tim's jokes, and occasionally Mike would catch her humming to herself as she worked, a habit she seemed unaware of, as if joy had found its way back into her body without conscious permission. Mike climbed down the ladder, surveying their work. The east wall is secure now. No more drafts from that side. Tim looked up from his labeling project. Dad, can we fix the broken fountain next to the one with the fish faces? Catherine glanced toward the ornate stone fountain in the conservatory's center, a relic from another era with carved fish spouting water from pursed stone lips. It had stood dry for years, basin cracked, pump long since failed. Her hesitation was barely perceptible. That was Jessica's favorite spot. She'd sit on the edge for hours, trailing her fingers in the water. The mention of her sister, rare despite their weeks of work together, hung in the air like delicate pollen. Mike noticed Catherine's fingers brush unconsciously against the faint scar on her wrist, a gesture he'd observed only when painful memories surfaced. We don't have to fix everything at once, Mike offered, creating space for her reluctance. Catherine's gaze lingered on the fountain before shifting to Tim's hopeful face. No, I think Jessica would like to see it working again. Let's add it to the list. Tim grinned, already imagining the restored feature. Maybe we could put fish in it, real ones? The possibility of life returning to yet another abandoned corner of Willowbrook seemed to settle something in Catherine. She nodded, decision made. Fish would be perfect. As afternoon faded toward evening, they gathered their tools, the satisfying fatigue of physical work evident in their slower movements. The transformation wasn't just happening to the conservatory. Something was shifting between them too, a comfort, a familiarity that transcended their different backgrounds. Outside, the February sky had darkened early, and snow had begun to fall in large, unhurried flakes. Mike paused on the conservatory steps, assessing the weather. We should head back before this gets worse. Catherine followed his gaze to the thickening snowfall. The forecasters are predicting 8 inches by morning. The roads down to town could be treacherous. Her suggestion came hesitantly. You could stay. There are plenty of rooms. It wasn't the first time she'd offered. On several occasions when work ran late or weather threatened, she'd suggested they remain overnight. Mike had always declined returning to their apartment regardless of the hour or conditions. Something about accepting that hospitality felt like crossing a boundary he wasn't yet ready to breach. Tim looked up at the snow with childish delight. Can we, Dad? Please, I could show Ms. Sinclair my plant notebook. Mike hesitated, calculating practical concerns. They had no overnight supplies Tim needed. His medication tomorrow was a school day. But beyond the practicalities lay something less tangible. The growing awareness that each visit to Willowbrook pulled them further into Catherine's orbit, creating connections that would be increasingly difficult to sever. Catherine seemed to read his thoughts. It's just one night, because of the snow. The simplicity of her justification made the decision easier. Just one night, Mike agreed. Inside the main house, Catherine moved through rooms with increasing confidence, turning on lights, adjusting thermostats, pulling covers from furniture that had stood unused for years. The grand home was slowly awakening from its extended slumber, sections coming to life with each weekend visit. After showing them to the same guest room they'd used that first night, Catherine disappeared briefly, returning with a small shopping bag. I took the liberty of purchasing some essentials. Toothbrushes, pajamas for Tim. I thought they might be useful. Eventually, the admission that she'd been preparing for their potential stay revealed more than her words. Mike accepted the bag, understanding the gesture represented something significant for a woman who had withdrawn from the world for 4 years. Tim's asthma medication, Mike remembered suddenly. We should have enough for tonight, but Catherine interrupted gently. There's a medical cabinet in my father's bathroom, fully stocked with emergency supplies, including several types of inhalers. My mother insisted Jessica had occasional attacks as a child. Another piece of Catherine's past offered up voluntarily another thread connecting their separate lives. The house seemed to encourage these revelations, as if its very walls were designed to hold stories. After a simple dinner assembled from Catherine's modestly improved food supplies, they settled in the library, a magnificent room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and leather chairs that had once hosted literary salons but had stood empty for years. Catherine had begun the process of reclaiming this space too, dusting shelves and uncovering furniture. A fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace, casting warm light across volumes that had waited patiently for readers to return. Tim, despite his earlier excitement, was fading quickly after the day's work. He curled in an oversized leather chair, his plant notebook clutched against his chest, eyelids growing heavier by the minute. Catherine watched him with a gentle expression Mike hadn't seen before. He reminds me of Jessica sometimes. That same curiosity, the way everything fascinates him. Mike lifted his sleeping son, the boy barely stirring, as he was gathered against his father's chest. I'll put him to bed. When Mike returned to the library, Catherine had moved to sit before the fireplace, a leather-bound album open on her lap. She looked up, gesturing to the chair opposite. Family photos, she explained, turning the album so Mike could see. I found it while clearing out my father's study last week. The photograph showed the Sinclairs in happier times. Catherine's father stern but proud. Her mother elegant, even in casual settings. Jessica always smiling, always in motion. And Catherine herself looking younger and unburdened, though even then more reserved than her animated sister. Jessica was the heart of our family. Catherine's fingers traced her sister's face in a group photo. She could make my father laugh even during his worst moods. She would have been 20 now, in college, probably driving everyone crazy with her energy. Mike studied the photographs, seeing echoes of the woman before him in the girl who had been. You were close. Catherine nodded, turning another page. When you lose everyone at once, it's not just the people you lose. It's all the relationships between you. The family ecosystem collapses. She stopped at a particular image, the four Sinclairs standing proudly before the conservatory in full bloom. Catherine's expression softened with memory. This was the summer before. My mother had won some prestigious gardening award. My father pretended to be annoyed by all the attention her orchids received, but he was secretly proud. He built the conservatory for her as an anniversary gift years earlier. Mike leaned closer, noticing details in the photograph. The vibrant plants, the functioning fountain, the family's easy posture with one another. It was beautiful. Catherine closed the album carefully, returning to the present. It will be again, different but alive. The snow continued falling outside, insulating the house in a blanket of quiet. In the firelit library, surrounded by books that had witnessed generations of Sinclairs, the walls between their separate worlds seemed temporarily thinner. Catherine rose, moving to a cabinet that revealed a collection of spirits. She poured 2 glasses of amber liquid, offering one to Mike. My father's scotch, 18 years old. He saved it for special occasions. Mike accepted the glass, though he rarely drank. What's the occasion? Catherine considered the question, firelight reflecting in her dark eyes. New beginnings, perhaps. They sat in companionable silence, the aged scotch warming a path through Mike's chest. Despite the grandeur surrounding them, the moment felt remarkably simple. 2 people finding unexpected connection through shared purpose and gradually revealed truths. When Catherine spoke again, her voice had softened with the hour and perhaps the scotch. Why did you answer that night my call? You never really explained. Mike considered his response carefully. When Kate died, there were nights I sat alone wishing someone would call, just to prove I wasn't invisible. He rotated the glass in his hands, watching the liquid catch the firelight. I guess I recognized something in your voice that I knew too well. Catherine's gaze held his, a current of understanding passing between them. Sometimes I think grief is its own language. Once you've learned it, you can hear it in others. The observation hung between them, profound in its simplicity. Outside, snow continued to fall, sealing them in a moment removed from ordinary time. Eventually, Catherine set down her empty glass. "I should show you something." She led him through the quiet house to a closed door on the ground floor. Unlike most spaces they'd explored during weekend work breaks, this room remained untouched by Catherine's recent efforts at reclamation. When she unlocked and opened the door, the scent of cedar and old paper emerged from the darkness. Catherine flipped a switch, revealing a spacious office dominated by a massive desk of dark wood. Architectural drawings hung framed on walls, models displayed on shelves, awards gathered dust in a glass cabinet. This had clearly been her father's professional sanctuary. Robert Sinclair was one of the most respected architects in the Northeast. Catherine moved to the desk, running fingers over its polished surface. Sinclair Architectural Design employed over 50 people at its peak. Residential projects, commercial buildings, even some public works. Mike stood respectfully at the threshold, sensing the significance of being invited into this preserved space. "I've seen the Sinclair building downtown. Never made the connection." Catherine nodded, pride mixing with sadness. "One of his earlier works. After the accident, I couldn't bear to make decisions about the firm. Richard arranged for partners to buy out most of the business interests, but I kept the intellectual property, the designs, the brand name. They're in trust until—" She paused, something shifting in her expression. "Until I was ready." She pulled open a desk drawer, removing a thick folder. This was his final project, the Sinclair Pavilion, a community arts center with gardens, performance spaces, classrooms. It was meant to be his legacy. The plans she spread across the desk revealed an ambitious design, modern yet harmonious, with natural surroundings, innovative but accessible. Even to Mike's untrained eye, the vision was impressive. "It was never built," Catherine continued. "The investors pulled out after his death. Richard said it was too ambitious, too personal to continue without my father's guidance." Mike studied the renderings, recognizing the passion embedded in the details. "It's remarkable work." Catherine gathered the plans carefully, returning them to their folder. "I've been thinking about it lately. Since we started restoring the conservatory, about unfinished legacies." The weight of her words settled between them, not just about architecture, but about lives, interrupted purposes, abandoned possibilities, left unexplored. Before Mike could respond, a sound from upstairs broke the moment. Tim's voice, sharp with fear. They found him sitting up in bed, breath coming in rapid, shallow bursts, eyes wide with panic. An asthma attack triggered perhaps by the unfamiliar environment or dust from long unused bedding. Mike reached immediately for the inhaler in his pocket, while Catherine hurried to fetch the emergency supplies she'd mentioned. Minutes stretched painfully as they worked together to ease Tim's breathing. Mike keeping his voice steady despite his fear, Catherine returning with a nebulizer she somehow knew how to operate. Gradually, Tim's breaths deepened, the frightening wheeze subsiding, though fear lingered in his eyes. When the worst had passed, Catherine disappeared again, returning with a humidifier and extra pillows to elevate Tim's head. Her movements were swift, decisive, as if emergency care was muscle memory rather than conscious thought. "My sister," she explained quietly, as Tim finally drifted back to sleep. Her attacks could come on suddenly, too. They sat together beside the bed, keeping vigil as snow continued to fall outside, sealing them inside Willowbrook. The shared crisis had revealed yet another layer to Catherine, not just the grieving heiress or the determined gardener, but a woman capable of decisive action when needed most. When Tim's breathing had stabilized completely, they retreated to the hallway, leaving the door ajar to hear any changes. "Thank you," Mike's voice was rough with residual fear. "You knew exactly what to do." Catherine shook her head slightly. After watching Jessica struggle so many times, it becomes second nature. She hesitated, then added, "It's strange. I've spent 4 years avoiding anything that reminded me of them. Now I find their memories are what helped me move forward." The admission seemed to surprise even her, as if she'd only just recognized this truth. They stood together in the dimly lit hallway, the sleeping house around them, snow falling beyond windows, creating a pocket of time that felt separate from their ordinary lives. "You should get some rest," Catherine said eventually. "I'll check on him through the night." Mike started to protest, but recognized in her expression the need to be useful to care for someone when she had been unable to save her own family. He nodded, accepting her offer while settling into an armchair near Tim's bed, where he could still respond if needed. The night passed in a series of quiet check-ins, Catherine appearing at the door to listen to Tim's breathing, Mike waking at the slightest sound. By morning, exhaustion had created its own kind of intimacy between them, a shared experience that required no explanation. The snow had indeed accumulated, as predicted, transforming Willowbrook into a winter landscape that reinforced its isolation from the everyday world. Roads would be impassable for hours until plows made their way up from town. One night's stay would inevitably extend into the day. Catherine appeared at breakfast with her laptop, something Mike had never seen her use during their weekend work. "I've emailed Tim's school about his absence, and your warehouse manager about the road conditions." She hesitated, then added, "I hope that wasn't overstepping." The gesture, practical, thoughtful, revealed how much attention she'd been paying to the details of their lives. Mike shook his head, touched by her consideration. "Thank you." Tim recovered from the night scare and thrilled by the snow. They pressed his face against windows between bites of toast. "Can we build a snowman, a whole snow family?" Catherine's smile came easier now, more natural than in those first strained days. "I think that's exactly what this place needs." They bundled up and borrowed coats. Catherine had begun keeping extra supplies for such contingencies, and ventured into the transformed landscape. The estate under snow revealed its bones more clearly. The formal garden layout, the pathways connecting structures, the graceful curves of land that had once been meticulously maintained. Tim raced ahead, leaving chaotic trails through pristine drifts, while Catherine and Mike followed more deliberately. The conservatory glittered in morning light, its restored glass reflecting blindingly against the snow, creating the illusion of a crystal palace rising from white grounds. "It's coming back to life," Catherine observed, watching steam rise from newly functional vents. "All of it." The day unfolded with unexpected ease. Snowmen constructed with serious artistic intent, an improvised sledding hill, created using an antique serving tray discovered in the pantry, hot chocolate made from supplies Catherine had recently stocked. Tim's laughter echoed across grounds that had known only silence for years. By afternoon, as they warmed themselves before the library fire, a comfortable familiarity had settled between them. The barriers between visitor and host, employee and employer, had softened into something less defined, but more genuine. When Catherine broached the subject, her approach was characteristically direct. "I've been thinking about your situation. The reduced hours at the warehouse, the apartment, with the unreliable heating, Tim's school across town." Mike tensed slightly, pride immediately on alert. "We manage." Catherine's expression remained carefully neutral. "Of course you do. But I have a proposition that might benefit us both." She gestured toward the windows where snow continued to fall. "There's a caretaker's cottage on the property. 3 bedrooms, its own garden plot. It needs work, but it's structurally sound. My father built it for the groundskeeper, who retired when I was in college." Mike said nothing, already anticipating where this was headed. "I need someone here full-time," Catherine continued. "The conservatory is just the beginning. There's the main house, the grounds, the outbuildings. Years of neglect to address." She met his gaze directly. "I'm proposing a job, Mike, not charity. A fair salary, the cottage, as part of your compensation. You have skills I need, and I have resources that could make your life with Tim less precarious." The offer hung between them, tempting in its practicality, yet complicated by unspoken implications. Moving to Willowbrook would mean leaving the life they'd built, modest as it was. It would mean tying their future to Catherine's in ways that extended beyond weekend work. It would mean acknowledging that boundaries between their worlds had already blurred beyond recognition. "I would need conditions," Mike said, finally, his voice careful. "I pay utilities for the cottage. I want a proper contract clearly outlining responsibilities. And Tim gets a section of the garden that's his alone, no questions asked, no interference." A smile touched Catherine's lips at the final condition. Done, done, and emphatically done. Before Mike could respond further, the distant sound of tires on snow interrupted the moment. Through the library windows, they watched as a black Mercedes carefully navigated the snow-covered drive chains on its tires, ensuring its progress despite conditions. Richard Blackwood's arrival cast an immediate shadow over the day's easy camaraderie. He stepped from his car with visible disapproval at finding Mike's truck still present, his expression darkening further when he spotted Tim making snow angels in the front lawn. Catherine met him at the door, her posture shifting back into the more guarded stance Mike had observed during their early encounters. Richard stepped inside, brushing snow from his immaculate coat, his gaze moving critically over signs of occupation. Boots by the door, mugs on the library table, the fire burning in what had been a cold hearth for years. "I see you've turned this into quite the winter retreat." Richard's words carried the sharp edge of disapproval thinly veiled as concern. "When you didn't answer my calls, I was worried." Catherine's expression remained impassive. The storm made the roads impassable. Mike and Tim stayed as a safety precaution. Richard's gaze flicked to Mike, assessing and dismissive in a single glance. How fortunate they were already here when the snow began. He turned back to Catherine, lowering his voice, though not enough to prevent Mike from hearing. "Catherine, people in town are beginning to talk. The Sinclair heiress and her handyman. It's not the image your father would want for the family name." Catherine stiffened, something flashing in her eyes that hadn't been present during their previous encounters with Richard. "What my father would want is irrelevant now, Richard. I'm making my own decisions." Richard smiled tightly, shifting tactics. "Of course you are. And soon you'll have even more significant decisions to make. Your 35th birthday is approaching, just 8 weeks away. The trust converts to your full control." He glanced meaningfully at Mike. "There will be people who see opportunity in that change of status." The implication was clear and deliberately insulting. Mike stepped forward, ready to defend himself, but Catherine moved first, her voice cool and controlled. "Richard, I need to speak with you. Privately. In my father's study." The two disappeared down the hallway, leaving Mike in the suddenly quiet library, the day's comfortable atmosphere effectively shattered. Through the window, he watched Tim still playing in the snow, blissfully unaware of adult complications. The boy deserved stability, security opportunities beyond what Mike's warehouse salary could provide. But was tying their future to Willowbrook and to Catherine truly in Tim's best interest? Before he could fully process the question, raised voices carried from the direction of the study. Catherine's normally controlled tone elevated with unmistakable anger. Richard's response clipped and defensive. Moments later, the study door opened forcefully, and Richard strode out, his usual composure visibly disturbed. He paused briefly when he spotted Mike. "Enjoy your time at Willowbrook while you can, Mr. Reynolds. Nothing here is quite what it appears to be." With that cryptic warning, he continued toward the front door, exiting without further acknowledgement. His Mercedes pulled away with more speed than the snowy conditions warranted, leaving black tracks across the pristine white drive. Catherine appeared in the library doorway, color high in her cheeks, eyes bright with remnants of anger. She watched through the window as Richard's car disappeared down the long drive. "I've made my decision," she announced without preamble. "About your employment here, about the cottage, about all of it." Mike waited, sensing the shift in energy, the determination in her stance. "I want you and Tim to move in as soon as possible, not just as caretaker and son, but as the beginning of something larger." Her eyes held a new clarity, a purpose that transcended their restoration work. "I'm going to transform Willowbrook. Not just the conservatory, all of it, into a place where children like Tim can come to learn to grow things, to find peace when the world feels too loud." The vision emerged fully formed, as if she'd been nurturing it silently for weeks beneath their practical work. The Willowbrook Center for Growing Things. Gardens, art spaces, quiet rooms for children who need them. Using what my family built to create something new. Mike studied her, recognizing that Richard's visit had catalyzed something that had been building within Catherine for some time. "That's a significant undertaking." Catherine nodded, her expression resolute. "Yes, and I'll need help. Your help specifically." She moved closer, her eyes fixed on his. "What Richard doesn't understand, what I'm only beginning to understand myself, is that things broken don't have to stay broken. They can be rebuilt into something different, something stronger at the mended places." The philosophy applied to more than just the physical restoration of Willowbrook. It encompassed all three of their lives, each fractured by loss, each seeking a way forward that honored what had been while creating space for what might still be. Outside, the snow had finally stopped falling. Tim's small figure continued making snow angels, each imprint a temporary mark on Willowbrook's vast white canvas. Inside, Mike and Catherine stood at the precipice of a decision that would reshape all their futures. "When can you start?" Catherine's question was simple, direct, characteristic of her evolving strength. Mike looked out at his son, considering all they had lost, all they had endured, and the unexpected possibility now before them. We already have. Spring came to Willowbrook in tentative waves, first the snowdrops pushing through melting drifts, then crocuses dotting the awakening lawn, finally daffodils and tulips emerging in forgotten beds, where Catherine's mother had planted them years before. The estate responded to the changing season with surprising vigor, as if the renewed attention had awakened something dormant in the very soil. The caretaker's cottage underwent its own transformation. Mike spent evenings and weekends repairing painting and renovating the three-bedroom structure that sat at the edge of the formal gardens. The work absorbed him completely, replacing worn flooring, updating the dated kitchen, ensuring the heating system would adequately protect him from winter chills that might trigger his asthma. Each improvement was an investment in their future, a physical manifestation of his commitment to this unexpected new chapter. Catherine threw herself into planning the Willowbrook Center with equal dedication. The dining room in the main house had become command central, its massive table covered with architectural drawings, nonprofit formation documents, grant applications, and community outreach materials. The vision that had emerged during Richard's confrontational visit gained substance with each passing day, transforming from abstract concept to detailed blueprint. Tim flourished in the expanded freedom of the estate grounds. His assigned garden plot, a sunny corner near the cottage with rich soil and a small decorative fence, became his kingdom. Catherine had ordered child-sized gardening tools, proper botanical markers, and seeds specially selected for their hardiness and quick results. The boy's knowledge expanded exponentially through hands-on experience and the growing collection of gardening books Catherine continued to supply. By late March, the cottage was ready. Moving day arrived with mixed emotions. Relief at escaping the cramped apartment with its unreliable heat and noisy neighbors, yet trepidation about the finality of the change. Mike's few possessions filled barely half the moving truck he'd rented. Tim's belongings occupied even less space, though his treasured books and plant specimens received careful attention. As they unloaded the final boxes at the cottage, Catherine appeared carrying a housewarming gift, a handcrafted wooden sign reading Reynolds Garden for Tim's plot. The boy's face lit with delight at this official recognition of his territory. For Mike, the gesture highlighted the strange duality of their new arrangement. Technically employees, yet increasingly treated as something closer to family. That evening, after Tim had fallen asleep in his new room, surrounded by carefully arranged treasures, Mike and Catherine sat on the cottage's small porch. The early spring air carried a lingering chill, but the promise of warmer days ahead softened its bite. "Does it feel like home yet?" Catherine studied his expression in the gathering twilight. Mike considered the question, looking back at the cottage with its fresh paint and repaired roof. "It will. For Tim, it already does. And for you," the question probed deeper than mere residential satisfaction. Mike recognized the layers beneath her words. Was he comfortable with this new life they were building? With the increasingly complex connection between them? With the dissolution of boundaries that had once seemed so clear? "I'm still finding my footing," he admitted, "between employee and whatever this is becoming." Catherine nodded, accepting his honesty. "I struggle with the same question. But I think perhaps the labels matter less than the purpose." She gestured toward the main house visible through the trees. 4 years of emptiness taught me that having a reason to wake up matters more than having the right definitions. Her philosophy resonated with Mike's practical nature. They were creating something meaningful together, a healing space for children, a sustainable future for Tim, a second chance at purpose for them both. Perhaps the exact nature of their relationship could evolve naturally without forced categorization. The conversation might have continued further, but headlights sweeping up the main drive interrupted the moment. Catherine frowned, checking her watch. "I'm not expecting anyone this late." The black Mercedes that appeared was instantly recognizable. Richard Blackwood emerged, his expression severe even from a distance. Catherine sighed, rising from her seat. "I should deal with this." Mike nodded, though unease settled in his stomach. Richard's visits invariably disrupted the equilibrium they worked so hard to establish. "I'll check on Tim." Through the cottage window, Mike observed Catherine and Richard engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion on the main house steps. Their body language spoke volumes. Catherine's arms crossed defensively, Richard gesturing emphatically toward the caretaker's cottage. Though he couldn't hear their words, their meaning was clear enough. Richard disapproved of the new arrangements of Mike's expanded role of the direction Catherine had chosen. When she returned nearly an hour later, Catherine's expression was troubled, but resolute. Richard brought paperwork for the trust transition when I turned 35 next month. She settled back into her chair, tension evident in her posture. He's still pushing for the Apex development deal. Mike had heard enough about the proposed luxury housing development to understand what it would mean. The demolition of the conservatory, the gardens, the outbuildings. Everything they'd been working toward would be bulldozed for upscale condominiums. What did you tell him? Catherine's smile held a new confidence, hard-won through months of reclaiming her agency. That my signature isn't available for sale. That Willowbrook will serve the community, not developers' profit margins. Her decisiveness should have been reassuring, yet Mike sensed something withheld. He didn't take that well. Catherine's gaze shifted toward the main house where lights still burned in Robert Sinclair's study. He mentioned some financial irregularities, investments that haven't performed as expected. He claims selling to Apex is the only way to salvage the Sinclair legacy. Her voice hardened, but I'm beginning to wonder whose interest he's really protecting. The implication hung in the night air. Richard's motives might not align with Catherine's well-being after all. Mike had suspected as much from their first encounter, but hearing Catherine voice the concern marked a significant shift in her perspective. I've scheduled a meeting with a different financial advisor next week, she continued, someone not connected to Richard or my father's firm. I need an objective assessment before my birthday. The approaching milestone loomed larger with each mention. In just 4 weeks, Catherine would gain full control of the Sinclair Trust, a transition that clearly made Richard increasingly desperate. April unfolded with accelerating momentum. While Catherine navigated the complex legal and financial preparations for her birthday transition, Mike focused on the physical transformation of Willowbrook. The conservatory now stood fully restored, glass-gleaming plants thriving, even the fish fountain, operating once more with half a dozen brilliant koi that Tim had named with characteristic creativity. Preparations for the center's opening advanced rapidly. Catherine had connected with local educators, therapists, and community leaders who embraced her vision with enthusiasm. The formal dining room hosted planning meetings where teachers described children who might benefit from therapeutic gardening, therapists suggested sensory-friendly spaces, and parents shared stories of kids who struggled in traditional environments. During one such meeting, Mike discovered a particular need that sparked his dormant creativity. A special education teacher mentioned the lack of adaptive gardening equipment for children with physical disabilities. Raised beds at wheelchair height, tools modified for limited grip strength, sensory-rich planting stations for kids with processing differences. That night, Mike found himself sketching at the cottage kitchen table long after Tim had gone to bed. Designs flowed from his pencil: specialized gardening benches, ergonomic tools, modular planting stations that could accommodate various needs. For the first time in years, he felt the familiar surge of creative energy that had once defined his work at Reynolds Custom Creations. The next morning, he showed the sketches to Catherine. She studied them with growing excitement, immediately recognizing their potential. These are exactly what we need. Can you build them? Mike nodded, already calculating materials and methods. I'll need a proper workshop space. Catherine's solution was immediate and characteristic of her evolving approach to Willowbrook's transformation. The old carriage house. It's structurally sound but unused. We could convert it to a woodworking shop. Within days, the carriage house renovation began. The spacious building with its high ceilings and abundant natural light proved ideal for woodworking. Catherine ordered tools, not just the basics, but professional-grade equipment that matched or exceeded what Mike had sold years before. When he protested the expense, her response was simple and pragmatic. It's an investment in the center. These pieces will make our program accessible to more children. The logic was unassailable, though Mike suspected her generosity extended beyond mere pragmatism. Still, he accepted the tools with appropriate gratitude, and soon the carriage house hummed with the sounds of creation. Saws cutting precisely measured lumber, sanders smoothing edges to prevent splinters, drills assembling components designed for specific needs. Tim spent hours in the workshop after school, learning to measure twice and cut once to recognize different wood grains to appreciate the craft his father had once built a business around. The boy's natural curiosity found new outlets in this shared creative space, strengthening the bond between father and son that had sometimes strained under the pressures of their previous life. As April progressed, the first prototype, an adjustable height planting table with wheelchair access, took shape. Mike worked through designs with meticulous attention, incorporating feedback from special education professionals Catherine had consulted. The finished piece was both functional and beautiful, its craftsmanship evident in every joined corner and smoothly finished surface. When it was installed in the conservatory, Catherine stood back, admiring not just the piece, but what it represented. This is what makes Willowbrook special, not just accommodating differences, but celebrating them. The observation touched something in Mike that had lain dormant since Kate's death. Pride in creation, in making something that mattered. The planting table was more than wood and hardware. It was opportunity made tangible inclusion given physical form. As he worked on additional pieces, Mike found himself revising his mental role at Willowbrook. He wasn't just the caretaker maintaining physical structures. He was a creator, helping to manifest Catherine's vision in practical, tangible ways. The realization shifted something fundamental in his relationship to both the place and the woman whose call had first brought him here. With Catherine's 35th birthday just a week away, preparations for both the trust transition and the center's opening intensified. Catherine met repeatedly with her new financial advisor, often returning to the main house with furrowed brow and distracted manner. Though she shared few details, her concern was evident. One evening, as they reviewed plans for the center's opening day, Catherine finally confided what she'd discovered. There are significant discrepancies in the trust accounts, investments that show paper losses but no corresponding transactions, missing quarterly reports, signatures on documents that don't quite match my father's. The implications were serious enough that Mike set aside the construction timeline they'd been discussing. Richard, Catherine nodded, jaw tight with controlled anger. My new advisor believes he's been systematically mismanaging, possibly embezzling from, the trust for years, using the confusion after the accident as cover. Her hands clenched on the table's edge. While I was lost in grief, he was stealing my family's legacy. The betrayal cut deeper than mere financial harm. Richard had positioned himself as protector of the Sinclair legacy while apparently undermining it for personal gain. His insistence on the Apex development deal now appeared in a sinister new light, not as misguided business advice, but as a desperate attempt to cover his tracks before Catherine gained full access to the accounts. We need proof. Mike's practical mind immediately focused on next steps, concrete evidence before making accusations. Catherine nodded grimly. My advisor is doing a forensic accounting review, but there's something else we need. My father's original estate documents. The lawyer who drafted them retired years ago, but his records should still exist somewhere. The search for those critical documents added urgency to an already hectic week. Catherine made calls to former associates of her father seeking anyone who might know where the original trust instruments were stored. Mike focused on completing the adaptive equipment for the center's opening, channeling his concern into productive action. 3 days before Catherine's birthday, Tim made the breakthrough they needed. While helping Catherine organize papers in her father's study, a task he approached with characteristic thoroughness, the boy discovered a hidden compartment in the massive desk. A gentle press on what appeared to be decorative molding revealed a narrow drawer containing a sealed envelope marked Originals, Sinclair Family Trust. Catherine's hands trembled as she carefully opened the envelope. Inside were the original trust documents bearing Robert Sinclair's distinctive signature, along with a handwritten letter addressed to his daughter. My dearest Catherine, she read aloud, voice catching on her father's words. If you're reading this, circumstances have required you to seek the original trust provisions. Trust your instincts. You have always had better judgment than I gave you credit for during our disagreements. The Sinclair legacy is not in our buildings or bank accounts, but in what we create for others. Your mother understood this better than I did. Perhaps you do as well. The validation from beyond grief's veil struck Catherine deeply. Tears gathered but didn't fall as she continued reading the technical details that followed. Instructions for authenticating the documents, contact information for trusted advisors, independent of Richard's specific provisions, she should verify against any versions Richard might present. He knew, Catherine whispered, hands gently cradling her father's final guidance. He suspected Richard might not be trustworthy. He left me a safeguard. Armed with the original documents, Catherine met with her new financial advisor the next day. By evening, she returned to Willowbrook with renewed determination. The advisor had confirmed Richard's malfeasance, systematic mismanagement dating back to the months following the Sinclair family's accident, discrepancies that could only be intentional evidence sufficient for legal action. My birthday meeting with Richard tomorrow will be different than he expects. Catherine's voice carried an edge Mike hadn't heard before. I've contacted the family's former attorney. He'll be present when I confront Richard with what we've found. The plan was strategically sound, yet Mike worried about the emotional toll of such a confrontation. Are you sure you want to handle this alone? I could be there. Catherine considered his offer, visibly weighing independence against support. I need to face him myself, to reclaim what he took while I was drowning in grief. Her expression softened slightly. But perhaps you could be nearby. In the conservatory, maybe. Close enough if needed, but allowing me to handle this on my terms. The compromise acknowledged both her need for autonomy and the strength they'd found in their evolving partnership. Mike agreed, recognizing this confrontation represented more than financial justice. It was Catherine reclaiming her power, her family's legacy, her right to determine Willowbrook's future. Catherine's birthday dawned clear and mild spring, fully established across the estate grounds. Mike spent the morning in the workshop, finalizing the last pieces of adaptive equipment for the center's opening, while keeping one eye on the driveway for Richard's inevitable arrival. When the Mercedes appeared precisely at the appointed hour, Mike set aside his tools and made his way to the conservatory as planned. Through the restored glass walls, he would have a clear view of the main house while remaining unobtrusive. Richard entered the mansion with his usual confident stride, leather portfolio tucked under one arm, unaware of the documentation now in Catherine's possession. From his vantage point, Mike watched the study windows, seeing only shadows moving behind partially drawn curtains. An hour passed with no outward signs of the confrontation occurring inside. Then suddenly the study door flew open. Richard emerged, his composure shattered, face flushed with anger or embarrassment. He stormed toward his car, nearly stumbling on the front steps in his haste to depart. The Mercedes peeled down the driveway, gravel spraying behind its tires. Mike waited, giving Catherine space to process whatever had transpired. When she didn't emerge from the house, he finally approached, finding her still in her father's study, standing by the window, watching the empty driveway where Richard's car had disappeared. He denied everything at first. Catherine spoke without turning. Claimed the discrepancies were administrative oversights, filing errors. Then he suggested my grief had made me paranoid. A bitter laugh escaped her. When I showed him the original documents in the forensic accounting report, he switched tactics, claimed he was protecting me from bad investments, that he'd made difficult decisions in my best interest. She turned then, and Mike was struck by the transformation in her bearing. Straight-backed eyes, clear chin lifted with quiet dignity. This was not the fragile woman who had collapsed in his arms that stormy night months ago. This was someone who had reclaimed her strength, her purpose, her rightful place. I've instructed the attorneys to pursue full restitution, including criminal charges if warranted. Her voice was steady, resolved. Richard has until tomorrow to surrender all Sinclair documents in his possession. After that, the legal process begins. The decisive action marked the final severance from her years of isolation and grief-imposed helplessness. Catherine had not only confronted her betrayer, but had done so with the cool competence her father had recognized in his letter. What did he say? Mike asked. At the end, Catherine's expression shifted, a hint of satisfaction visible beneath her composed exterior. He asked how I could do this to him after all he'd done for me, as if stealing from me while I grieved was some kind of favor. She shook her head, disbelief mixing with emerging clarity. I told him that broken things don't have to stay broken. They can be rebuilt into something stronger than before. The words echoed their earlier conversation, but now carried the weight of action behind them. Catherine had applied this philosophy not just to Willowbrook's physical restoration, but to her own reclamation of agency. What happens now? Mike leaned against the study door frame, giving her space while offering presence. Catherine moved to her father's desk, running fingers across the polished wood, where generations of Sinclairs had made decisions that shaped their legacy. Now we build something new. The center opens next weekend. My family's resources are mine to direct. Willowbrook will serve the purpose I choose for it. She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. The purpose we've been creating together. The inclusion, the we that acknowledged their shared vision, settled something that had remained unspoken between them. They had moved beyond employer and employee, beyond rescuer, and rescued into a partnership based on mutual respect and common purpose. The week leading to the center's opening unfolded with frenetic energy. Final installations of adaptive equipment, training sessions for volunteer staff, safety inspections, promotional materials distributed throughout the community. Each task checked off Catherine's meticulous list brought the vision closer to reality. Mike completed the last specialized gardening station the day before the opening, a sensory-rich planting area with different textured materials, aromatic herbs, and tactile elements designed for children with sensory processing differences. Its construction represented the culmination of his rediscovered craft, each detail considered from the perspective of children whose needs often went unrecognized in standard environments. As he installed it in the conservatory, Tim worked alongside him, attaching descriptive plaques in both standard text and braille, a feature the boy had specifically requested after meeting a visually impaired child during one of the planning sessions. Catherine observed their teamwork with evident pride, the scene embodying everything Willowbrook Center aimed to create: connection, purpose, opportunity without barriers. It's perfect. Catherine's assessment encompassed more than just the physical structure. All of this is exactly what this place was meant to be. The day of the center's opening dawned with cooperative weather, sunshine warming the grounds, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of newly blooming flowers across pathways now cleared and defined for accessibility. Colorful banners marked the entrance, welcoming visitors to the Willowbrook Center for Growing Things in cheerful, inclusive lettering. Catherine had chosen to keep the opening deliberately small, inviting families identified through local schools and service organizations rather than staging a grand public event. The approach reflected her priority, creating genuine connection rather than publicity. As the first families arrived, Tim assumed his role as official garden guide, with solemn responsibility, proudly wearing the badge Catherine had created for him. He led small groups through his special garden plot, explaining plant life cycles with the expertise of someone 3 times his age. His earlier shyness transformed into confident enthusiasm when discussing his botanical knowledge. Mike managed the adaptive equipment demonstrations, showing parents and caregivers how the specialized stations accommodated different needs. His natural ability to explain technical details in accessible language proved invaluable as visitors explored the possibilities Willowbrook offered their children. Catherine moved throughout the grounds, welcoming each family, personally kneeling to speak directly with children, ensuring every visitor felt individually valued. The genuine connection she established with each newcomer revealed how far she'd traveled from the isolated grief that had once defined her existence. Midway through the event, as families explored the various spaces created for them, Catherine gathered everyone near the conservatory entrance for a brief address. She stood on the stone steps, sunlight filtering through restored glass behind her, the once abandoned structure now vibrant with life and purpose. "Welcome to Willowbrook," she began, voice steady and warm. For too many years, this place stood empty, frozen in grief and memory. But empty spaces can be filled again. Broken things can be mended into something new, often stronger at the repaired places than they ever were before. Her gaze moved across the gathered families, lingering briefly on Tim, standing proudly beside his garden plot, on Mike, watching from near the adaptive stations he'd created. The Willowbrook Center exists because a wrong number connected people who needed each other at exactly the right moment. 4 years ago, I lost my family in an accident that left me alone in this too-large house. I existed rather than lived, surrounded by memories, but unable to create anything new. She paused, allowing the personal revelation to settle among her listeners. Then one night at 2 in the morning, I made a phone call. I meant to reach my therapist during a moment of crisis. Instead, I dialed the wrong number. Her eyes found Mike's across the gathering. But perhaps it wasn't wrong at all, because a stranger answered and came when I needed help most. And he brought his remarkable son, who taught me that even neglected gardens can grow again with proper care. The simple truth of their beginning, spoken aloud for the first time in this public setting, Acknowledge the journey that had brought them all to this moment. Not just the physical restoration of Willowbrook, but the emotional restoration of three lives connected by circumstance and choice. What you see here today, the gardens, the conservatory, the adaptive stations, this center dedicated to growing things, exists because of that mistaken call and what came after. Willowbrook will never again be just a monument to loss. From this day forward, it will be a place where all children feel welcome, where parents find community, where differences are accommodated, not as afterthoughts, but as essential elements of our design. The response from gathered families wasn't the polite applause of formal ceremonies, but the authentic appreciation of people who recognize genuine welcome. Parents wiped tears, children asked eager questions about when they could return, educators exchanged excited observations about possibilities for their students. As the official program transitioned into informal exploration and conversation, Catherine found Mike near the fish fountain where Tim was enthusiastically introducing his named koi to captivated children. "You did it," Mike observed quietly. "Created something extraordinary." Catherine shook her head slightly, correction implicit in her gesture. "We did it, all three of us." She watched Tim demonstrate proper fish feeding techniques with patient care. "I provided resources, but you and Tim provided the heart of this place." The acknowledgement of their shared creation felt right, more honest than artificial boundaries between employer and employee, more accurate than attributing Willowbrook's transformation to any single person. As evening approached and the last visitors reluctantly departed with promises to return, the three of them remained in the conservatory surrounded by evidence of their months of work. Tim eventually succumbed to the day's excitement, falling asleep on one of the cushioned benches Mike had crafted specifically for quiet moments in the space. Catherine and Mike stood by the now illuminated fish fountain, its gentle splashing providing peaceful background to their conversation. LED lights installed beneath the water cast soft, shifting patterns across the glass ceiling, creating an atmosphere of contained magic. "Happy birthday," Mike said softly, acknowledging the day's other significance. "Quite a way to mark 35. Catherine smiled, the expression now coming naturally where once it had seemed foreign to her features. "The best possible celebration. Reclaiming my family's legacy while creating something new." She glanced toward sleeping Tim, then back to Mike. "Something that matters beyond myself." The depth of transformation struck them both. Not just the physical restoration of abandoned spaces, but the restoration of purpose, connection, meaning. From Catherine's grief-imposed isolation to the vibrant community they'd welcomed today. From Mike's struggling single parenthood to the stability and creative renewal he'd found at Willowbrook. From Tim's asthma-restricted existence to his flourishing expertise in the gardens. "I have something for you." Mike reached into his pocket, producing a small wooden box crafted from the same oak he'd used for the conservatory furnishings. A birthday gift, though, that seems inadequate for what today represents. Catherine accepted the box, fingers tracing the inlaid pattern on its lid, a delicate rendering of the conservatory's distinctive silhouette. When she opened it, her breath caught visibly. Inside lay a pendant, a perfect miniature of a moth orchid bloom, hand-carved from pale maple wood, suspended on a slender silver chain. "It's from the first tree we cleared when restoring the pathway," Mike explained. "I thought there was symmetry in that, creating something beautiful from what needed to be removed for new growth." The symbolism wasn't lost on Catherine. She lifted the pendant, carefully holding it to catch the fountain's gentle light. Like everything broken, finding new purpose. Mike took the necklace from her fingers, offering to secure it around her neck. As she turned, lifting her hair to allow him to fasten the clasp, the moment between them shifted. Intimate without demand, significant without pressure. "I don't know what we are to each other." Catherine spoke softly as she turned back to face him. "Beyond the obvious roles of property owner and caretaker, beyond partners in creating this center. I just know that wrong number was the first right thing to happen to me in 4 years." Mike studied her face in the gentle lighting, no longer gaunt with grief, but filled with purpose, determination, and something softer he hesitated to name. "Some things don't need labels to be real," he offered. "They just need honoring for what they are." Catherine nodded, hand resting lightly on the wooden pendant, now nestled against her collarbone. "And what is this exactly?" The question invited honest assessment of the connection that had grown between them. Gradual, unexpected, complicated by their different backgrounds, yet simplified by their common experiences of loss and rebuilding. A beginning, Mike answered simply, the kind that doesn't erase what came before but builds something new on the foundation that remains. The philosophy echoed through their shared work at Willowbrook, honoring the estate's history while reimagining its purpose, acknowledging grief while creating space for joy, respecting what had been lost while embracing what might still grow. Catherine considered his answer, finding truth in its patient recognition of their journey. I think beginnings are exactly what Willowbrook does best. They stood together in the conservatory that had once symbolized abandonment, but now represented renewal, surrounded by thriving plants, adaptive equipment, ready for returning children, and Tim sleeping peacefully nearby. The tableau captured everything the Willowbrook Center promised. Not erasure of difficult pasts, but growth despite them. Not forgetting what was lost, but creating meaning from what remained. 1 year later, Willowbrook Center celebrated its first anniversary with an expanded program serving over 50 families regularly. The conservatory operated at capacity with waiting lists for several specialized programs. Catherine's financial restoration of the Sinclair Trust, following Richard's legal settlement and removal from any connection to family affairs, had enabled further development of the grounds and programming. The cottage had become undeniably home for Mike and Tim. The boys' garden plot had expanded twice to accommodate his growing expertise, now featuring native plant identification markers that served as educational tools for center visitors. Tim's asthma had improved significantly with the combined benefits of clean air, regular outdoor activity, and reduced stress. Mike's workshop in the converted carriage house had evolved into a formal program component, Adaptive Solutions, where he designed and built specialized equipment not just for Willowbrook, but for other organizations serving children with diverse needs. The skills he'd honed at Reynolds Custom Creations found new purpose and expanded application, his craftsmanship recognized beyond the estate's boundaries. The main house had undergone its own transformation, with formerly unused rooms converted to classroom spaces, therapy areas, and administrative offices for the growing staff. Catherine had moved from the master suite that held too many parental memories into a smaller, brighter apartment created from what had once been the East Wing guest rooms. The three lives that had intersected through a misdialed number had grown intertwined in ways none could have anticipated, not erasing individual identities, but strengthening them through connection. Not replacing lost loved ones, but honoring their memory through meaningful creation. On this anniversary evening, after the celebration concluded and visitors departed, Catherine, Mike, and Tim sat on the main house veranda, watching fireflies emerge over the gardens as dusk settled across Willowbrook. Tim fighting sleep, but determined to finish his latest botanical sketch, curled in an oversized wicker chair with his notebook propped against drawn-up knees. Catherine's fingers absently traced the wooden orchid pendant. She rarely removed her gaze, taking in the transformed landscape before them. I had a call today from the National Accessible Garden Association. They want to feature Willowbrook in their annual showcase. Mike nodded, pride evident, but understated. Your father would be impressed, transforming the family legacy into something that serves others. Our transformation, Catherine corrected gently. All of this happened because you answered a wrong number at 2 in the morning. The reference to their unlikely beginning had become something of a private touchstone between them, a reminder of how seemingly random connections could alter life's trajectory completely. Tim finally surrendered to exhaustion, notebook slipping from his fingers as sleep claimed him. Mike gathered his son carefully, the boy heavier now, but still fitting comfortably in his father's arms. I should get him to bed. Catherine rose, gathering Tim's scattered pencils and sketchbook. I'll walk with you. The path from main house to cottage was well worn now, traveled countless times in all seasons. As they walked in comfortable silence, the evening settling around them like a familiar blanket, Catherine's hand found Mike's freed one, fingers intertwining with practiced ease. The gesture required no explanation, no definition beyond what it was. Connection freely chosen, maintained through daily decision rather than obligation. The kind of beginning that continued to unfold with each passing day. At the cottage door, Catherine brushed a gentle hand across sleeping Tim's hair before stepping back to allow Mike to carry him inside. Good night, my garden guide. The affection in her voice contained multitudes. Appreciation for the boy who had first seen possibility in abandoned spaces, for the child whose resilience had inspired her own, for the unexpected addition to her once solitary life. After settling Tim in his bed, Mike returned to the porch where Catherine waited, her silhouette outlined against the deepening twilight. They stood together, observing Willowbrook spread before them, no longer a monument to grief, but a living testament to renewal. Sometimes the most important things in life come from mistakes, Catherine observed softly, her hand finding his again. Wrong numbers, missed flights, unexpected turns. Mike considered this truth, thinking of the grief that had hollowed them both before chance connected their separate paths. Not wrong turns, maybe, just different routes to where we needed to be. Catherine leaned slightly into his solid presence, accepting the warmth and stability he represented without diminishing her own strength. The woman who had once been unable to breathe through grief now stood firmly in a life rebuilt, through conscious choice and shared purpose. Stay, she said simply. The invitation contained everything that had developed between them. Trust earned through consistent presence, connection deepened through shared creation, understanding formed in the crucible of parallel losses. Not a request born of desperate midnight loneliness, but a choice made in the clear light of experienced love. Mike's answer came without hesitation, the culmination of a journey that began with a wrong number that somehow connected exactly the right people at precisely the moment they needed each other most. I already have.